The letter in Amara Bell's purse was 3 days late for a promise it could never keep. Final notice: foreclosure proceedings begin in 5 business days. She had read those words so many times the ink seemed to burn itself onto the back of her eyelids. And now, sitting alone in the marble lobby of Cross Tower on the 52nd floor, she pressed her palm against the outside of her bag, just to feel the paper was still there, still real, still a countdown she could not stop. In 4 days, the small bakery her mother had bled sweat and pride into for 11 years would belong to a bank. In 4 days, the only inheritance Amara had left of the woman who raised her alone would become a number on a spreadsheet. And the one man who could change everything with a single signature was, according to the receptionist's apologetic smile, running a little behind. An hour. She had been waiting an hour in a chair so expensive it probably cost more than her mother's old delivery van, watching executives glide past her in tailored suits, feeling every second tick against her ribs like a slow drumbeat counting down to disaster. She had rehearsed this meeting for a week. The words, the tone, the proof. She'd brought that Cross Industries owed her family more than money. They owed her family the truth about what happened 11 years ago in a warehouse on the edge of town. But rehearsal was easy in the mirror. It was not easy here, in this glass tower built on money that had crushed people like her father into statistics nobody remembered, because Amara Bell was not just late on a loan. She was the daughter of a man named Elijah Bell, a foreman who had died trying to save 3 coworkers when a Cross Industries manufacturing plant caught fire. Due to safety violations, the company had quietly settled and buried. She had grown up being told her father was a hero the world forgot. Today, she intended to make sure the world, and the son of the man who signed off on those cost-cutting safety failures, finally remembered. At exactly the 58th minute, the elevator doors opened, and Julian Cross walked out like a man who had never once in his life been kept waiting for anything. Fair skin, storm gray eyes, a smile that looked like it had been perfected in front of 100 cameras, and a jaw that could have sold watches on a billboard. "Sorry I'm late," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I was firing someone. Turns out it takes longer to fire people nicely than it does to just fire them." Who knew kindness was so inefficient? He extended a hand. Amara did not take it. "You kept me waiting an hour, Mr. Cross," she said, voice steady even though her heart was a hummingbird trapped in her chest. "I hope whatever you were doing was worth it." "Everything I do is worth it," he said, dropping into the chair across from her, loosening his tie like he owned the air itself. "Except small talk. I'm terrible at small talk. Ask anyone who's ever been trapped with me at a charity gala." His eyes flicked over the folder in her lap, the one thing in the room that didn't sparkle. "You're not here about an investment pitch. You've got that look. What look is that?" "The look of someone who's about to ruin my whole afternoon." He said it with a grin, but something behind his eyes sharpened, like a man who had learned long ago to smell trouble before it arrived, because trouble in his world usually came wearing a smile and carrying a lawsuit. "I'm here," Amara said, opening the folder, forcing her hands not to shake, "because 11 years ago, your father's company killed mine." The lobby around them seemed to go quiet, though nothing had actually changed except the air pressure in Julian Cross's carefully built world. His grin did not vanish immediately. That was the strange part, Amara would think later. It flickered, held on for one more second, like a man refusing to believe the ground was already gone beneath him. And then it dropped completely. "I think," he said slowly, "you'd better come up to my office." That was the shocking beginning of a story that would, in the weeks to come, unravel everything Julian Cross believed about his family's empire. Everything Amara Bell believed about the impossibility of justice for people who looked like her, and everything both of them believed about who deserved to be loved. Julian's office occupied the entire 53rd floor. Glass on every side, so the city spread beneath them like a kingdom he had inherited rather than earned. He poured 2 glasses of water. "I'd offer you something stronger, but it's 2 in the afternoon and I try to reserve day drinking for board meetings." And sat across from her, all traces of charm now folded carefully away like a jacket he'd taken off. "Tell me," he said, "everything." So she did. She told him about Elijah Bell, a foreman at Cross Manufacturing's East Side plant. A man who used to sing off-key in the kitchen every Sunday morning, while he made pancakes shaped like uneven state outlines. She told him about the fire, a wiring fault the company had been warned about twice, and ignored because the repair would have delayed a shipping deadline. She told him how her father had gone back into the burning building for 3 coworkers who couldn't get out, how he'd saved all 3, how the roof had come down on him 30 seconds after the last one made it to safety. She told him about the settlement Cross Industries paid the other families, quiet and generous enough to keep them from talking, and about the one thing they never gave her mother, because her mother refused the money on principle. An apology, on record, admitting fault. My mother spent 11 years running a bakery on a street corner, working 16-hour days so I could go to college, telling me every single morning that dignity mattered more than money, Amara said, her voice finally cracking, just slightly, on the word dignity. Now she's sick, congestive heart failure. She can't work the ovens anymore. The bakery is 4 days from foreclosure, and I found out last month, going through my father's old union files, that Cross Industries Insurance Company falsified the fire marshal's report to reduce liability. I have the documents, Mr. Cross. I have proof your family's company lied about what killed my father. Julian sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the folder like it might detonate if he touched it. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of its earlier polish. My father died 2 years ago. I inherited a company I never asked to run, full of decisions I never made, sitting on secrets I'm only now starting to find because half his executive team is still loyal to him and not to me. He rubbed his jaw. If what you're telling me is true, I need to see it. All of it. Because if my company falsified a death report to save money, I want that fixed. Not managed, not settled quietly. Fixed. Why should I believe you? Amara asked. Rich men make promises to poor women all the time, Mr. Cross. It's practically a hobby for people like you. Something flashed in his eyes. Not anger, but recognition, like she'd landed a hit closer to truth than she knew. Fair, he said, but I'll make you a promise anyway, and you can hold me to every word of it. Give me 72 hours. 72 hours to review those documents with my own legal team, not my father's old guard. If they check out, I will personally guarantee your mother's bakery, cover her medical costs, and reopen the investigation into that fire, publicly, on record, with my name on it. And if you're lying, he met her eyes without flinching. Then you walk into every news outlet in this city with those documents, and you destroy me. I'd deserve it. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, Amara left Cross Tower that afternoon with her chest tight, with a feeling she hated admitting to herself. She believed him. And worse, much worse, for a woman who'd spent her whole life building walls against men exactly like him. She found herself thinking about the way his eyes had softened when he said fixed, not managed, and wondering what kind of man hid underneath all that easy, practiced charm. The 72 hours became a week, and the week became something neither of them expected. A partnership that felt dangerously like friendship, and a friendship that felt dangerously like more. Julian called her 3 days later, not with a lawyer on the line, but alone. Your documents are real, he said without preamble. I had my forensic accountant verify the falsified report. I also found out my father personally approved the cover-up, and personally approved the payout structure, designed to keep grieving families quiet. I wanted to tell you myself before my legal team turns this into a press release with more lawyers in the room than humanity. Thank you, Amara said, and meant it more than she expected to. Don't thank me yet. There's a board meeting Thursday. Half of them are going to try to bury this, because burying things is what they've always done, and because I'm the new CEO who hasn't earned enough trust yet to stop them without a fight. A pause. I might need your help in that room. Not your documents, you, telling your story. I know that's an enormous thing to ask Agav. Why me? Why not just present the paperwork? Because paperwork doesn't make people uncomfortable enough to change, he said. But a woman standing in front of a room of executives, telling them her father died because they valued a shipping deadline over his life, that makes it impossible for them to hide behind numbers anymore. She agreed, though she told herself it was for her mother, for her father's memory, for justice, not because some reckless, foolish part of her wanted an excuse to see Julian Cross again, wanted to hear that self-deprecating laugh, wanted to know what lay beneath the armor of jokes he wore like a second skin. They worked together for the 2 days before the board meeting, and it was in those 2 days that everything shifted. He was sharper than his charm let on, funny in a way that made her laugh even when she didn't want to give him the satisfaction, and beneath the joke she began to see cracks. A boy who had grown up being told his worth was measured in acquisitions and stock prices. A son who had spent 30 years trying to earn a cold father's approval and had inherited an empire built on that same coldness instead. "You use jokes like a shield," she told him one evening, both of them exhausted, sitting on the floor of his office surrounded by financial records instead of the desk that felt too formal for what this had become. "Everyone needs armor," he said. "Yours is dignity. Mine is comedy. At least mine's more fun at parties. Is that what this is to you? A performance?" "No," he said, and for once there was no joke waiting behind it. "This is the first time in years I've actually wanted to fix something instead of just manage it. You did that, not the documents. You." The air between them had grown thick with something neither of them dared name, something that felt like it violated every rule Amara had built to protect herself from men who came from worlds like his. And yet, when he reached over and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek, she did not pull away. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered. "The worst," he agreed, leaning closer. "I have several spreadsheets that would strongly advise against it, Julian." "I know," he said softly. "I know exactly what I'm risking. Do it anyway." She kissed him first. It surprised them both. Cliffhanger struck 2 days later, at the 1/3 mark of everything that was about to unravel. Amara arrived at Cross Tower for the board meeting to find her mother's hospital, calling her cell phone 6 times in a row. Her mother had collapsed. Cardiac arrest. She was being rushed into emergency surgery, and the doctors were not confident she would survive the night. Amara stood frozen in the lobby of the very building that represented everything that had taken her father from her, now potentially about to take her mother too, and in that single unbearable moment, she understood with sickening clarity. If her mother died before the board meeting, before the truth came out, before Julian could keep his promise, the last member of her family, and quite possibly the only proof of her family's dignity, would be gone forever, and Cross Industries lawyers would have every reason in the world to bury the whole story along with her. She never made it to the board meeting. She made it to the hospital instead, sitting in a waiting room for the second time in her life, while a Bell family member fought for a life inside a building she had no power to change. And this time, there was no billionaire keeping her waiting. There was a billionaire racing across the city, having abandoned his own board meeting the second he heard, sprinting through hospital doors just as the surgeon walked out with a look Amara couldn't read. "Is she?" Amara couldn't finish the sentence. The surgeon's face broke into something like relief, and Amara's knees nearly buckled beneath her. "She's stable. It was close, but she's stable. She's a fighter." Amara sank into a chair, sobbing the kind of sob that had been building for 11 years. And Julian, CEO of a company he had walked away from mid-crisis to be here, knelt in front of her and simply held her hands while she fell apart. No jokes, no armor, nothing but presence. "You should be at your board meeting," she managed to say through tears. "There'll be other board meetings," he said. "There's only one you." But the story was not finished being cruel. While Julian had been at the hospital, his father's former chief legal counsel, a razor-voiced woman named Vanessa Kell, who had built her career protecting the Cross family's secrets, and who saw Julian's newfound conscience as an existential threat to everything she'd spent 2 decades constructing, had convened an emergency session of the board in his absence. By the time Julian returned to Cross Tower that night, the board, under Vanessa's maneuvering, had already voted to open an internal restructuring review of his leadership, citing his erratic decision-making and conflict of interest with an outside claimant, a polished corporate phrase for the woman he loved. Worse, Vanessa had leaked a distorted version of the story to the press, that Julian Cross was being manipulated by a grieving woman seeking a payout, weaponizing an old tragedy for financial gain, and that the CEO's judgment was compromised by a personal relationship with the very person suing his company. By morning, Amara's name and photograph were splashed across gossip sites, painted not as a grieving daughter seeking justice, but as a gold-digging opportunist who had seduced a vulnerable young CEO. Comment sections filled with cruelty she recognized instantly, the particular, ugly flavor of cruelty reserved for a dark-skinned woman daring to stand beside a wealthy white man, as though her grief, her intelligence, her dignity could all be erased by a single word designed to diminish her to nothing but her skin and his money. "They're trying to destroy you to protect themselves," Julian said, fury shaking in his voice as he stormed into her mother's hospital room, phone full of headlines he wished he could burn. "They're trying to destroy me because it's easier to attack me than to face what your father did," Amara said quietly. And there was something in her exhaustion that broke his heart more than any headline could. "This is what happens to women like me, Julian. We tell the truth and get called liars for the privilege. Then we tell a bigger truth," he said, one they can't spin. The second cliffhanger arrived at the 2/3 mark, sharper and crueler than the first. Vanessa Kell, cornered and desperate to protect her own legal exposure, because it had been her signature, Julian discovered in a late-night dive through archived files that authorized the falsified fire report 11 years earlier, not just his father's, arranged an emergency press conference of her own, live, unscheduled, broadcast before Julian or Amara even knew it was happening. Vanessa stood before cameras and calmly, coldly announced that the Bell family's claims were an attempt at emotional extortion, that Amara Bell had a documented history of financial desperation, twisting the foreclosure notice, private medical bills, everything Amara had shared in confidence, into a public narrative of a con artist targeting a wealthy, naive young executive. Amara watched the broadcast from her mother's hospital room, her mother barely 24 hours out of surgery, squeezing her hand and saying, in a voice weakened but unbroken, "Baby, we've survived worse than lies. Rise anyway." But the damage was staggering. Cross-industry stock dipped on the instability narrative. The board scheduled an emergency vote, not on the fire report anymore, but on removing Julian as CEO entirely, framing his relationship with Amara as proof he could no longer separate personal feeling from professional judgment. And in the cruelest twist of all, Vanessa produced, seemingly from nowhere, a document appearing to show that Elijah Bell himself had once been cited for a safety violation on the same factory floor years before the fire. A half-truth stripped of context, weaponized to suggest her father's own negligence, not the company's, had caused the tragedy that took his life. For the first time since this began, Amara watched Julian's confidence crack completely. He arrived at the hospital pale, hollow-eyed, a man watching everything he'd built, and everything he'd finally started to believe he could become, collapse in real time. "I can fight the board," he said. "I can fight the stock drop. But I don't know how to fight a lie that's already halfway around the world, before I've even laced up my shoes." "Then we don't fight the lie," Amara said, standing despite her exhaustion, despite the hospital fluorescents washing everyone in gray, despite everything the world had thrown at her in one impossible week. "We give them the truth so loud it can't be spun. All of it. Together. In front of every camera they've got." He looked at her, really looked at her, this woman who had lost her father to his family's negligence, who had nearly lost her mother while fighting for justice, who had been publicly slandered for daring to love him, and who was still, somehow, standing upright and offering him a plan instead of walking away. "You could still leave," he said quietly. "Nobody would blame you if you took the money, fixed your mother's bills, and disappeared from this mess forever. I'm not doing this for money, Julian. I never was." She took his hand, the same hand that had once nervously clutched a foreclosure notice in a marble lobby, now steady, sure. "I'm doing this because my father deserved better. My mother deserves better, and honestly, so do you. You've spent your whole life being told your worth is what you inherit. Let's show them what you're actually worth." The press conference Julian called 2 days later was unlike anything Cross Tower had ever hosted. He stood not behind a podium of talking points, but beside Amara, hand in hers in full view of every camera, and told the truth without a single joke to hide behind. He confirmed the falsified fire report. He confirmed his father's and Vanessa Kell's roles in covering it up. He released Elijah Bell's full, unedited safety record, showing the violation Vanessa cited had in fact been Elijah reporting the very wiring hazard that later killed him, a hazard the company chose not to fix. He announced full financial restitution to the Bell family, a public memorial fund in Elijah Bell's name for workplace safety advocacy, and, in a move that made the entire boardroom of old guard executives go pale, his intention to personally push for Vanessa Kell's removal and prosecution for evidence falsification. "I know what this looks like," Julian told the cameras, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "A CEO in a relationship with a woman suing his own company. Let me be clear, I am not defending Amara Bell because I love her, although I do. I am defending the truth because it's true, and I happen to be lucky enough that the truth and the woman I love are standing on the same side of this room." He turned to Amara, ignoring the flashing cameras entirely. "You were right about everything. My father's company took your father from you. It should never have happened, and no apology will ever be enough. But I promise you this, it stops being buried today." Amara, who had spent her whole life being told that women who looked like her had to fight twice as hard to be believed once, stood in front of the nation and told her father's story in full. Not as a victim, but as his daughter, carrying forward the dignity he'd spent his life teaching her to protect. "My father ran into a burning building to save people who weren't his responsibility to save," she said. "He believed doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. I think, somewhere along the way, that belief found its way to someone else in this story, too." She glanced at Julian. "Rebuilding trust is slow. Rebuilding safety standards is slow. But truth, once it's finally spoken out loud, doesn't go back into hiding. Not this time." The board vote to remove Julian never happened. Public and shareholder support flooded in overnight in his favor once the full truth was known, and Vanessa Kell resigned in disgrace before formal charges were filed. Amara's mother recovered fully over the following months, reopening her bakery not on a foreclosure notice but on a lease. Julian quietly paid off and never mentioned again. Because, he told Amara, some things shouldn't be transactions, they should just be love, plain and unspoken. A year later, on the anniversary of the fire, Cross Industries opened the Elijah Bell Workplace Safety Institute, funded permanently, staffed by engineers whose sole job was preventing exactly the kind of tragedy that once tore a family apart. Amara stood at the ribbon cutting not as a claimant or a headline, but as a board member of the very foundation created because she refused to let her father's death be quietly forgotten. Julian stood beside her, no longer hiding behind jokes, though he still made them, just gentler ones now, the kind meant to make her laugh instead of keep her at a distance. "You waited an hour for me once," he said, slipping his hand into hers as the ribbon fell. "I think I've been trying to make up for that ever since." "You have," she said, smiling. "Turns out the wait was worth it.